How are you? Welcome to the Otherppl Show. My name is Brad Listi, and I am in Los Angeles. It's nice to be with you. How are you out there? I hope you're doing okay. I have a wonderful program for you today. I'm very excited about it. I'm excited to share it with you. But before I get there, I have some news. I have some good news that I want to share. I have a couple of orders of business that I want to attend to. And both are good news. So the first bit of good news is that I have sold my novel. That happened just a few days ago. It all came together. The novel is called Be Brief and Tell Them Everything, and it is going to be published next spring, I believe in the month of May, by IG Publishing. And, you know, for people who listen to this show regularly, you probably know about this book. I talk about it sometimes in monologues, or I've brought it up in conversation. I have been working on it for a very long time, many years. And, you know, it's one of those stories. Many drafts, many iterations, many failures, many creative implosions, a lot of time spent in the wilderness, the creative wilderness, and the literal wilderness. You know, feeling disillusioned. And you know what? If I'm going to get sappy, I should play some music. So there were times when I thought that it was not going to materialize, that the book was just going to fail. But now it is going to materialize. It appears as though it's going to see the light of day, and that it has, you know, come together. And I'm delighted about that. And, you know, the reason that it happened is that I kept going back to it. As much as I wanted to at times, I couldn't quit this book. I had to write it for, you know, a variety of reasons that I will not enumerate for you here right now. But I finally did it. You know, I said what I needed to say. And, you know, you'll be able to read it next spring. So, you know, my social media director, Joseph Grantham, he posted on, you know, this show's Twitter feed and on its Instagram feed, the Publishers Marketplace little blurb that goes out. You know how this works? Like when a book sells, there's an announcement in the trades, and, you know, there's a little log line. And many of you might have seen this on social, but if you missed it and you're wondering to yourself, like, well, what is this book about? I'll read you the log line, just so you can get a sense of it. So it says, Brad Listi's Be Brief and Tell Them Everything, a darkly humorous meditation on what it means to create, tracking the life of a father who is struggling to write his next novel while trying to come to grips with his son's disabilities, against a backdrop of ecological catastrophe and escalating human insanity. So it's a light summer read. It's perfect for the beach. And it was a very difficult book to write. And, you know, maybe that's a silly thing to say because probably all books are difficult to write, but this one felt grueling for me. And what I hope is that all of the difficult work will make for an easy and enjoyable reading experience. That's the idea. Once again, the book is called Be Brief and Tell Them Everything, out next spring of 2022 from IG Publishing. I should thank Robert Lasner and Elizabeth at IG Publishing for buying the book. I should thank my agent, as one does, Erin Hosier. We've been together for almost 20 years. And not only is she, you know, like a trusted reader and a patient advisor, she's also just a buddy. She's a good friend at this point, and I'm grateful to her. I should thank Chelsea Hodson and Tao Lin, both of whom are very gifted writers, both of whom who have appeared on this show before, both of whom read the manuscript and offered their thoughts and encouragement. Likewise, I owe Marcy Dermansky, herself a gifted writer, my thanks. She helped to edit an earlier iteration of this book some of which made its way into this final version. But, I call her, somewhat jokingly, one of my doulas, She helped this thing to be born, if I may use that analogy. And she has so far very skillfully avoided coming on this program, which I plan to fix at some point down the road. But Marcy is, she's sneaky. Like with the skill of a ninja, she has avoided me to this point. So I could go on and on thanking people. Obviously, I should thank my family, but I'm not going to, make you suffer through me reading through a list of all the people to whom I owe thanks. I will probably be talking more about this in the weeks and months ahead. I hope that's okay. I'm not going to overdo it, but I'm proud of this book. I worked really hard on it for a long time, and I'll kind of try to bring you along for the ride as I move through the process. So, having said that, there's one more bit of good news that I should acknowledge, and that is the birthday of the Otherppl podcast, the 10th birthday. This show is 10 years old now. It turned 10 officially on September 14th. The first episode of this program, the first ever episode, was a conversation with Jonathan Evison that aired on September 14th, 2011. And now a decade has gone by, more than 700 episodes. And here we are. We're still going. I think it's common for podcasters when they hit a big round number to thank their audience and to thank their guests, especially if they're doing an interview show. And that's appropriate because the show could not exist without these people. So once again, I must thank the people who listen and the people who were kind enough to talk to me on this program. I appreciate it. I never thought I would do this for this long, and I think I keep doing it because it feels good. It's gratifying to do this, and it's edifying to do this. And I hope to do it for a long time. You never know what life will bring, but I kind of half joke that I want to do this until I'm 90. And I think in my latest thinking about podcasting, like this project, I think a lot of it is tied to thoughts of endurance and sticking it out and continuing to make stuff regardless of what anyone thinks or says or does. Making stuff because you enjoy making stuff. The same could be said for my writing. It's just kind of an aspiration as a creative person, and also I think hopefully an insight into where the value lies for me in a project of this nature. I think there's something to be gained in sticking with it for a long time. Hopefully my intuition on this is correct. But anyway, thank you everybody for listening over these first 10 years, and I'm excited to embark on the show's second decade today. And it's actually nice that I'm talking about things, related to endurance and sticking it out and having the courage of one's convictions or whatever, because the subject of today's episode is the late, great Mark Baumer. And I had the opportunity to talk with Blake Butler, Shane Jones, and Claire Donato, all three of whom have had a hand in a new book out right now from Fence Books. It is called The One on Earth, Selected Works of Mark Baumer. It is a wonderful addition to his creative legacy and his activist legacy on Earth. Mark Baumer was a writer, he was a performer, he was a diarist, he was a digital artist, he was an environmental activist. He was all of these things and more. And for those of you who don't know, Mark Baumer died tragically in January 2017 while attempting to walk across the United States of America barefoot. He was doing this in an effort to raise money for the Fang Collective, which is an activist group that works toward environmental justice and related issues. And in addition to that, Mark was walking to raise awareness and to sound the alarm about climate change. His barefoot walk across the United States was an act of endurance. It was an act of self-sacrifice, self-documentation. It was an act of resistance, an act of performance art. The list goes on. In all, he walked barefoot for 101 days, covering many hundreds of miles, before he was killed, tragically, on a Florida highway in Walton County, struck by an SUV as he was walking against traffic, wearing a reflective vest, following safety conventions, in the middle of the afternoon. Mark Baumer was a beloved figure in the literary community and in the activist community. He was a beloved partner to Ada Smelbegovich. Forgive me, Ada, if I botched your name. And, of course, he was a beloved son to his parents, Jim and Mary. Mark Baumer was just 33 years old when he died, and since his death, his life and his work have grown in stature as the rest of the world has just begun to catch up to him. He was ahead of his time. I know that, that phrase gets thrown around a lot, but he really was. He was a person of rare courage and moral clarity, and he had a deep understanding of the moment that he was living in. So again, there's this brand new anthology of Mark's work available from Fence Books. It is called The One on Earth. It was edited by Blake Butler and Shane Jones, with a foreword by Claire Donato, and I was lucky to have the chance to talk with all three of them about their late friend and colleague, Mark Baumer. As you'll hear me say in the conversation, I never had Mark on this show, and it is one of my everlasting regrets. It is, it's inevitable when you do a show like this that you're going to make some mistakes and miss some opportunities. I had a bit of an epistolary relationship with Mark Baumer, as many people in the literary community did, but I never got around to having him on the program, and I wish that I had. I think we would have had a great conversation, and we would have gotten along. And, this was many years ago, before I had a full sense of who Mark was and what he was up to. And sadly, it was only after his passing that I was able to get a real sense of his life and his life project. He was a rare human being. And so, in preparation for today's episode, I watched a wonderful documentary film about Mark Baumer. It was directed by Julie Sokolow, and it is called Barefoot. I can't recommend this film highly enough. You should see it. I think you can download it at various streamers. I want to say I watched it on Amazon Prime, which, it's kind of ironic to watch a film about Mark Baumer on Amazon Prime, but there you go. We can't escape. And I thought that it might be helpful to play some audio before we get started with today's conversation. I am going to play you the audio from the trailer to the documentary entitled Barefoot, so that you can hear Mark Baumer in his own voice, talking, as he so often did, to his phone camera as he was out on the road doing his barefoot walk. And you'll also hear the voices of people who knew and loved Mark. So, obviously it's a little bit easier to watch the trailer and see these people talking, but I think you can listen to it and get the gist just fine. So here is the audio from the trailer to Julie Sokolow's documentary on the life and legacy of Mark Baumer. One more time, the film is called Barefoot.
All right, well, be good, house. Don't fall apart while I'm gone. I'll miss you. Oh man, I just realized I'm running across America barefoot! Oh, it's really happening!
He was sort of standing in a corner of this room and he said, I'm going to go on this barefoot walk.
This is how I walk through New York City. Barefoot. Barefoot.
He was really hitting his stride as a writer and a poet. You know, doing this kind of almost like guerrilla theater where he'd go out with his camera.
He said I'm going viral. He said I'm going viral.
Oh yeah, this dude's awesome. He's crossing the country with bare feet.
He wanted to save the planet. He wanted to make people aware of climate change, that we're destroying the Earth.
You know, climate change isn't something we will worry about in the future. It's now. The Earth is just getting warmer and warmer. And the thing about it is, all these changes to the Earth, these are all human-induced.
He was doing something really dangerous. And he knew that it was dangerous. And I think that was kind of the point, in a way.
If I die on this trip, it's not going to be because I didn't wear shoes. It's going to be because an automobile kills me. Anytime you walk near automobiles, you're putting yourself in danger.
We were just like, we should just tell him to come home. Like, why didn't we tell him to come home?
My journey across the country is a metaphor to not give up.
People have talked about Mark being this, barefoot vegan superhero. You thought that Mark somehow was invincible, that there was nothing that could take Mark out.
There is something beautiful about the road. It's a symbol of going somewhere. And I just prefer to do it on my own 2 feet.
So there you have it. That is the trailer for Julie Sokolow's excellent documentary Barefoot about the life and legacy of Mark Baumer. If you have not seen the film, see the film. If you have not seen Mark's work online, I recommend that too. He left us so much. His videos live on the internet. So much of his writing is available on the internet. He was, among other things, a remarkable internet person/artist. He had mastery over the entire thing, it seems to me. As somebody who struggles with this stuff, I marvel at his abilities. And, as a writer, he was enormously gifted. And I think the saddest and most frustrating part of it for me as a reader is this feeling that he was just beginning to realize his power. He was only 33 years old. But in this new anthology, we have a variety of his best prose, what he left behind. It is a collection that really captures who Mark Baumer was and what he cared about, how intelligent he was, and how absurdly funny he could be. He had a great sense of humor and a great sense of the absurd, which, I think if you're engaged in the kind of work and activism that Mark was engaged in, you almost have to have that. He was dealing with a lot of heavy stuff and he was looking at a lot of darkness, and he had his absurd humor as a kind of armor against it. So I think I'll stop there. I hope I've done a decent enough job of setting this up. I want to get you oriented into the life and work of Mark Baumer. And now I think I'll transition to my conversation with today's guests, Blake Butler, Shane Jones, and Claire Donato. Once again, these are the folks who edited and wrote the foreword, respectively, to the new book, The One on Earth, Selected Works of Mark Baumer, available from Fence Books. This is my conversation with Blake Butler, Shane Jones, and Claire Donato.
I met Mark probably the same way, I'm assuming that maybe Blake and Claire did, and you as well, Brad, is through the internet and just the online community at the time. So I think we started trading emails and writing and things like that back in maybe 2006. I don't know exactly when. And then the first time I met Mark physically is when he invited me to Brown, where he was getting his MFA, and he was also teaching an undergrad class, and it was like no experience that I have ever had before. So like when we entered the room, I was with Mark, and everybody was singing happy birthday to me, even though it wasn't my birthday. And then it like turned into like a chant. And Mark also brought a huge bag full of like different kinds of potato chips for everybody. And like that's how the class just started. And like from then on, it was just like vintage Mark Baumer. But yeah, that's my first. So like meeting through the internet, exchanging writing and things like that, then physically meeting him at Brown, and then we hung out a couple times after that.
All right. And Blake, how about you?
Mark started emailing me. I think we were both kind of, it was a big heyday for like small presses and small magazines. So I feel like there were just slews of them. I would see Mark all the time in there. He was just publishing work as early as anyone. Like among the people that have been around in publishing for a while, Mark was just like in every magazine. And I was doing magazines, and he would email me like crazy. It wasn't like, "Hi, how are you? I'm Mark. I'm a writer." It was like, "I'm out in the yard," just like non sequitur, insane stuff. Sometimes he'd attach different manuscripts that were also insane, and I don't know. I just like we kept. He threatened me early on because one of his friends had a magazine that I got in a scuffle with, and he was like, it was like a threat letter with as if a team of clowns was going to come to your house and kick your ass or something. Like it just like, it wasn't scary. It was just funny, but it was like, who is this guy? I don't know. And so over the years that just continued and grew and blossomed as Mark grew as a person too. I think he was like kind of insane and off the map in the beginning, and as he got older, he found what to do with that energy, and the relationship matured. So lots of different phases with him, and all of them special, I think.
And Claire?
And my relationship to Mark, I guess, is inverted from Blake and Shane's relationship to Mark. We attended the MFA Literary Arts program at Brown University in Providence together. So I started in that program in 2008, and Mark began in 2009. We were in different genres. He studied fiction and I studied poetry, but we crossed paths in the program, became friends there, and subsequently struck up internet correspondence, and we had both finished the program. I've curated in the digital arts, and Mark came to the series I curated and presented there. We read together a number of times after graduate school, and we're generally in touch. And then after he passed away, I helped organize the celebration for his life at Brown, and have been sort of working to keep his spirit alive since his passing.
Cool. And I guess I should say, I'm probably going to say this in the monologue, so listeners are going to be hearing me echo what I just said moments ago, but I have very limited interaction with Mark, but I did email with him. And one of the reasons why I'm so excited to talk with you guys and to make this episode is one of my great regrets is that I did not have him on this show. And when you do a show like this, you, especially over a long time, you get a lot of people emailing you, and I'm not great about keeping up with all of it. It's too much. And sometimes you whiff, and I feel like I whiffed. I wish so badly that I could have talked with him, and that I wouldn't have whiffed. So this is going to have to do. And reading this book, and I just watched the documentary Barefoot that I found to be really moving. It's by Julie Sokolow, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and I recommend it if you want to dive deeper into Mark's life and legacy. But thinking about all of it, I can't help but wonder about what kind of artist he was, because we lost him so young, and I can't escape this feeling that he was just starting to find his footing and his voice, and I think he would have done really interesting things, but I don't view him as only a literary artist. he was so many different things, and I'm not sure which one would have emerged as his like main platform, or maybe he would have just done all of them because he was kind of a hyphenated, multi-talented. But do you guys get what I'm saying? Like, Blake, what do you think about this? Like, how do you consider him? Do you consider him like just one kind of artist, a multimedia artist, like a reality star, a comedian? Like, all these words kind of pop into my head when I think about him and what he did.
I think those are all valid things to call Mark. I don't know. I think early on I thought of Mark as a writer's writer because he seemed so free. But I don't even know what really a writer's writer is anymore. And I really just think maybe Mark just lived and breathed what he did in a way that a lot of people don't. He didn't sit down and say, I'm a writer. He just like made up worlds. He made up universes. He embodied personas, enacted them to strangers on the street. I think he just wanted to cause people to interrupt the droning life that we often end up in, and cause good chaos instead of bad chaos for once. Just his presence makes people react and question what's even going on, which I think is I love that in anyone, but in Mark in particular. Alien life form, Jesus. Claire refers to him as Pee Wee Herman. I don't know. He's alive in a way that I think I wish more artists were. And so yeah, but at the same time I do call him a writer because I think he's also I don't know. I like the novel in this collection because I think amongst all that and all of the his Instagram and particularly the walk and how much attraction that brought him. Like Mark was a really brilliant writer and could have written the book that made him a bigger literary presence, if that's what you want to call it. But I think he also had some antagonism against that whole process. Him calling his famous like YouTube series where he's calling literary agents and just like lambasting them and weeping and saying insane stuff. It's just like he didn't want to play ball with bullshit. He couldn't do it. It just wasn't in him. And so I don't care what else he did. I just look at him as a person that way and say, this is someone we should aspire to figure out what makes him tick and remember.
Claire, what would you have to say about what kind of artist he was, if that's a way to put it?
I just wrote down a list in silver Sharpie, so I think I'll recite my list. I have digital poet. I think Mark was a culture jammer. He was a straight edge zinester and punk. Also a multimedia performance artist, which may or may not be the same thing as being a digital poet. He was, I think that Anna Hayward from The New Yorker called him a compulsive social media diarist, which is a really beautiful descriptor. He was a curator of fruits and vegetables and a DIY vegan mystic, a lyrical activist, and a trickster novelist.
Okay. I mean, Shane, I don't know what you would add to that, but I mean, do you have anything else that he was that we haven't gotten to?
I mean, I think Blake and Claire definitely covered it. One thought I had just listening to both of them, I think Mark was like Richard Brautigan, mixed with Andy Kaufman, but politically minded, and then also with a moral compass like nobody else I've ever known. And you can kind of keep going. Like, it's just the complexity of Mark. It's just mind blowing. And Claire had mentioned earlier on about organizing the celebration of life for Mark. And what was so amazing about that, each person that spoke about Mark spoke about him from like a radically different background and what he did from the next person. Like, I just couldn't believe it. Like, there was one person who spoke, and I might get this wrong, but I think he like was on the same baseball team as Mark, and Mark was like a exceptional baseball player. Like, he would just hit home run after home run. Like, he could have been like a baseball star. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. Like, he could just do like so much. And back to what you had said, Brad, like, it's a difficult topic or thing to think about, but I really wonder where Mark would have gone in his like path of like maturity. Like Richard Brautigan, Andy Kaufman, like they seem to be very immature artists in a lot of ways. And like where Mark, like what would have Mark been doing at age like 55 or 60, I think it would have been like nothing else we've ever seen, really.
Yeah, I just, it's not to say that he wasn't formed. There's a sensibility there and a voice there that's unmistakable, but it's also because he was so young when he passed away. It's hard not to get the nagging feeling that he was just getting started and would have grown so much and was like such a good brain and had such a big heart. But this is somebody who I think was exceptionally intelligent, exceptionally sensitive and empathetic. And the word that comes to mind is radical, like a truly radical human being in the etymological sense of that word, which, I always like to point out because I think it's gotten co-opted by like surf culture or, whatever. Like radical can kind of take on a negative connotation in the culture sometimes because it can be attached to like, more base political elements or whatever. But the word radical is derived from the Latin word for root, to get down deep into something. Like Mark seemed to be able to do that more easily than most. And he had a real moral clarity. And I don't know, Claire, if you said the word activist. Has anybody said the word activist? I think you did. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So he certainly was that too. And then the word political, Shane, you brought up, which I think is interesting because, from my perspective, like my observations through the years, you don't normally see literary artists, particularly of a certain generation maybe, but in general, it's not all that common for somebody to be this political in their work, this unapologetically. Like there was no posturing or trying to be cool or sly about it. Like he had the kind of moral clarity that you see out of like Greta Thunberg. He, especially when it came to issues surrounding the environment and climate change, it was just like unblinking. Claire, I'm curious to know, if in your time at Brown with him, if that was there from the jump, like when did this materialize in him? I'm curious to know how he got to that place. Is it just genetics? Did he read something? Was there somebody who was mentoring him? Like, where did this passion come from?
Well, I think about his time in college intuitively comes to mind for me. And if I'm remembering this anecdote correctly, Mark, I think, authored a piece for the campus newspaper that perhaps got him in trouble. So in response to that, he created his own zine on campus. I think that was an underground publication that was disseminated. Again, this might need a fact check, or maybe the zine is what got him into trouble. But I think about that, or like straight edge zinester culture, as an act of radical journalism with which he was engaged quite early on. When he passed, he was on this walk raising money for the Fighting Against Natural Gas FANG collective in Providence, and was partaking in actions with them. I opened the book with an anecdote about him protesting against Textron, which was an industrial conglomerate based in Rhode Island that manufactured cluster bombs used to kill civilians in Yemen. So he was arrested during, an on-site protest at the Textron facility with fellow activists from FANG. So there was...
Wait, I don't mean to interrupt, but didn't they chain themselves to a gate or something?
They did, yeah. If I open up the book here, they were seated on the ground in nonviolent protest, and Mark was obstructing the front door. And then after they were photographed during this action, they were all arrested. So, I mean, I think it's quite, I don't know, I don't want to say it's totally rare for literary artists or artists to partake in that sort of direct action activism. But in terms of Mark's writing, the politics or activism is both deeply embedded within his writing, but then he also had his feet on the ground and was in the world collaborating with other people to affect change.
Yeah, to put your body on the line like that, and to do these kinds of things, in public, to be willing to be criticized, to be willing to be annoying. You know, I think it's something that a lot of people either don't consider or they resist out of some feeling of discomfort or just not wanting to be exposed in that way. And he was fearless, which I really admire. And I couldn't help but think as I was reading and as I was watching the documentary, like how well his environmental project and protest is going to age. I think that there might be people who think of him as being an extremist, you know, with the barefoot thing, especially, but also just, you know, putting his body on the line and being so consistent and persistent in attacking interests that are working to damage the environment. But like, talk to us in 50 years. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, he's going to look moderate compared to what is in store for us if we don't change like massively and soon. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, Shane, do you have any thoughts like along those lines?
Well, yeah. I mean, Mark, he wasn't doing any of this for, you know, likes or retweets. Like, he's just doing it because he was just driven and felt like it was the right thing to do. And I guess that's radical in a lot of ways, but there's just a purity about that in Mark and what he was doing. And that seems, not that it's not seen anywhere, but it was so refreshing to see when Mark was doing it. Absolutely.
Do you guys know, does anybody know anything about his spiritual background and interests? Because I watched the documentary. His parents appear in it, and they seem lovely. But I couldn't help but wonder, like, what kind of like spiritual orientation did he have, both as a child? I know he was like straight edge, kind of in the punk scene. He went to Wheaton College, which I believe is a religious school, a Christian school. But also, I was looking at his reading lists, and you know, it's very diverse in its orientation. I'm just curious to know like where he was at spiritually in his life, and if any of that informed his choices around activism and art. Does anybody know anything there? You can just raise your hand. I'd be interested to know.
I believe that there was perhaps Baptist upbringing early on, and then a familial breakaway from the church. And I hope I'm not getting this incorrect. So I think Mark did come up around some Christianity in childhood. And then when he passed away, he was interested in Buddhist thought, which certainly was informing eating practices, right? And veganism. He was getting into yoga. He had a pretty dedicated Ashtanga yoga practice and was doing transcendental meditation on the walk, which is the David Lynchian school of meditation via which one gets a secret mantra. I love how a couple times a day.
I love how David Lynch has essentially supplanted like the Maharishi or whatever. You know, it's now David Lynch's. Like, he's now a spiritual leader.
Totally. The Church of David Lynch.
Yeah. I can't tell you how. I mean, I live in Los Angeles. Everyone's walking around chanting their mantra around here. But I want to talk. You know, Shane, you said something interesting about how pure Mark was, and certainly that comes off the page and comes off the screen when you're watching his videos or watching this movie about him. And how he didn't do it for likes or retweets in the kind of egoistic sense. I think he did want attention to the cause. And his dad says in the film that he did want to be famous. So maybe there was some egoism in there. You know, there is for all of us, right? We're all artists. It's not like we don't want attention. But there still was that purity, kind of like an Andy Kaufman-esque purity. And I can't help but also want to point out how incredibly good at the internet he was, in ways that I will never be. Like, I am internet awkward, like now and forever. Like, I have some envy when it comes to people who have mastery over like even one social platform. But I feel like Mark was so good at all of it, and there was like kind of a maximalist approach that he took to the internet. Or maybe this is just generational and I'm just old, but like he was everywhere, right? He was like Snapchatting and YouTubing and tweeting, and doing, I don't know, he was just doing all of it and doing all of it pretty well. His website's super interesting and cool. And I don't know. I guess like Blake, I would ask like for you to comment on like that aspect of his creative life and public life and maybe how to reconcile it. I guess like to him, he was cause driven and I mean, also art driven. He did want people to know who he was. And yet somehow the purity still comes through in ways that it often doesn't for people who are that online.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's no coincidence that David Lynch comes up here because David Lynch's big mantra is dream big, go get the dream. Mark lived his life as if it was a dream and that he could do anything he wanted, and while acknowledging his privilege to do so. But I think he saw that privilege as a responsibility to not only glorify himself or his religion or whatever, but to lift up others and to do so with a sense of humor and a depth not, a lot of this activism, I think a lot of people get turned off from activism because it's so cold and dry a lot of the time and it's so morally righteous and do this or you're bad, etc. And Mark's website's hilarious. Mark's feeds are hilarious. That's why people are attracted to it and they feel empowered in that. So there's this inclusionary feeling that Mark has where you're like, you're watching him do these crazy acts, walk into crowds, and put his body in the middle of stuff, and you realize this is just a person taking action about what they believe in for once. Why is that rare? Maybe he's incited to action because there is something about I don't know. I have this weird thing about people who die young before their time, and how much are they aware of it, and what do they feel a pressure in themselves about? And I don't know, throughout Mark's videos, it's clear he's aware of death. It's clear that he realizes time on Earth is short, and not only for him, but for all of us if we don't stop acting the way we do. And for once, that results not in I'm accruing this awareness for my own benefit, but seriously like a scream, like, no, I'm not kidding.
Right.
I'm joking. I'm trying to bring you in, but seriously, like, let's stop this and like let's care for one another. There's like an empathetic thing in there that's on one hand real, and on the other hand angry and desperate and begging you to get involved. And so I don't know. I there's a depth to Mark that few have. But why? Why do few have that? I don't know. Because we don't look at ourselves, because we're afraid of death, because we're consumers, etc. All things he fights against, and so there's a lot of levels to it. But at the end of the day, I just know we keep talking about the depth of his spirit and his realness, and that's the common denominator here, I think.
Yeah. I mean, there's a couple of anecdotes that come to mind. I think I've mentioned them on this show in conversations before, but they bear repeating now. And like one of them that sticks with me has to do with Gary Snyder, the environmentalist and Pulitzer-winning poet, and how he was talking to some young environmental activists, and he was telling them that if they are going to be activists and they're going to do this work, that they shouldn't do it because they feel guilty over the degradations of the environment. They shouldn't feel guilty because they are participants in the destruction, as we all are, one way or another, because we're burning fossil fuels and consuming, and one way or another, it touches all of us. He said you shouldn't do it out of guilt. You should do it because you love it. If that's the animating force that's driving you in your activism, you're likely to be able to sustain it longer and be more effective, I think was the message. And that really resonated with me because I was raised Catholic and I can feel guilty about anything, so guilt is always my first go-to, but, doing it from a real passion and a deep love of the environment and this planet and, just appreciating how wild it is that we're even here. I think Mark had that. A second anecdote is one from Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist Zen teacher from Vietnam, who I know Mark read and was influenced by. And he was talking about peace activists because he, Thich Nhat Hanh kind of made his name as a peace activist during the Vietnam War era and ever since. And he said that far too many peace activists are not peaceful. Some of the angriest people in the world are the people who are yelling about nonviolence and an end to war. And this is a mistake. And that sticks with me. If you want to be an effective peace activist, you have to be peaceful yourself. And I don't know how perfect it is. I think I can get a little gray on this because I do think there's such a thing as righteous anger, and I think it can be a good animating force. But the point, I think, remains that you have to have some core of peacefulness and love that's kind of guiding your actions. And I think that's what we're feeling in Mark. I think that's why he was effective ultimately, is that for all of the absurdity and humor and desperation and sometimes anger, you always knew that you were dealing with somebody who was honest and kind and just an empathetic, loving human being. He's so obviously good, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Shane, I don't know. You're not going to refute me on this, are you?
I'll kind of take off where you left off there. Being good, or I think Mark, felt like we only have so many, laps around the sun, and how do I be a good person in this short time frame? That's kind of what it boiled down to a lot. How do I be a good human being? And that purity and that unfilteredness, you mentioned the aggression, it all came through. And I just want to go back, and you mentioned the way he used the internet. It was just the pedal to the floor at all times. It seemed like he just used everything, and he didn't care what the reaction is. I know when Mark was alive and I had talked to people, and they thought, their first reaction is he's annoying. People would think he's and they just didn't get it. It was you've got to get past that a little bit. But yeah, I just want I need to be a good person in these few years that you have on the earth. Mark, he just lived by that. Absolutely.
Well, and also, I think so often, just because of the pressures that capitalism brings to bear on us, just trying to survive, make ends meet and keep a roof over our heads, we don't often have enough time to consider the consequences of the work that we do, or many of us don't. And he certainly managed to do that. And he wasn't he was a privileged individual. Blake, I think you touched on that. We all have our privilege, and he certainly acknowledged his, or most of us do, or some of us do. But he cared so much, I think, and thought so much, it seems to me, about what the consequences of his actions were going to be in the professional realm. And I feel like there are so many people in America in particular who are kind of going through their days, checking in at the office, getting their paycheck, not really thinking deeply about what it is that they're doing and how it might ripple out and affect others. And it's funny that, with this pandemic the past couple of years, there's been a lot of pieces written about how a lot of folks, because of the pandemic and the situation that it brought to bear on all of us, for the first time maybe ever, had that opportunity. But, Mark, I think, was trying to speak to us on that wavelength as well. Stop and consider what you're doing with your work life. And it's a big challenge, I don't think he necessarily had it all figured out. He was struggling, just like most writers and artist people, to figure out a way forward. But it's a conversation that I think we need to have, about the ways in which we make our living and whether or not it's net positive. Claire, do you have thoughts on this? If anybody wants to jump in, I know I'm kind of rambling, but it really does feel like it's at the heart of what Mark was up to.
I do. I pulled up this evening Gatha that's recited at Zen monasteries. This is the translation used at Zen Mountain Monastery in Mount Tremper. So at night before going to bed, the head teacher or somebody who's leading recitation might say this, and it goes, "Let me respectfully remind you, life and death are of supreme importance. Time swiftly passes by and opportunity is lost. Each of us should strive to awaken. Awaken, take heed, do not squander your life." And I think about that Gatha, or this idea of awakening, in relation to Mark and Mark's artistic life and activist practices, which were all one and the same, right? There weren't parameter boundaries separating them. And I think, like, moving beyond this idea of good or bad, he was dedicated to self-work, and I think possessed the deep knowledge from Buddhist teachings and from being out in the world, in the environment, that we are one with the earth, right? Which sounds sort of corny to say aloud, but it's true. Like, the earth is the same stuff as our bodies, and the Barefoot Project, I think, is his attempt at coming as close to the earth as possible in order to kind of metaphorically show that interdependence, right? Or that same stuffness. And to also, I think, like, inflict upon his body the suffering that the earth is experiencing, to share that pain. And again, in Buddhist thought, love is shared pain, right? Or recognizing pain in somebody else or some other entity, and taking it on, or seeing it, or being with it, staying with it. So I don't know if any of this amalgamates into anything. I also jotted down, or I've been thinking a lot over the past few months, about how heart is an anagram for earth. And it feels important that he was walking upon the earth, which is an anagram for heart. And I don't know, it's in my mind every day, multiple times a day.
That was beautifully said. And I think it gets like right to the heart of what he was doing. It makes the barefoot walk, which I think at first blush for some people might just seem like craziness, or some kind of masochism. But it was performance art, and it was deep ecology and Buddhist wisdom, if you want to put it that way. I also think about, if we're going to continue along this line of thought regarding the consequences of one's work and the best use of one's time on earth, I think about right livelihood, which is one of the, what is it? Right livelihood is the Eightfold Path, right? There's the Eightfold Path in Buddhism, and right livelihood is one of its tenets. And I'm sure he read that and thought about that, and feels like a natural kind of extension, from that to what he was doing. I also, I want to talk a bit, Blake, with you about his aesthetic approach as a writer, probably first and foremost, but also just as a creator. There's something that you said, I believe in an interview that was published, or a profile that was published after Mark passed away, and I'm going to read it to you and then let you respond. But you said, quote, "He was a great sentence writer. He destroyed sentences. He had to break up everything that was in front of him. I think he was capable of writing conventional things that people would take seriously, but that didn't interest him." This resonated with me. There's a deconstructive element to what he was up to, and kind of an insistent absurdity. Can you just expand on that a little bit? I'm interested to hear you talk a bit more about what you mean by he destroyed sentences.
Well, there's a lot of answers to that. I think, first of all, it's just like, he wasn't afraid to write anything. And I always think, like, when we write sentences, like, any word can be the next word in the sentence, and yet we follow the rules a lot of the time of, we want our novel to be read by people. We want our novel to be important and to have profundity and all this stuff. But Mark trusted himself enough to say, like, that's in me. That's part of me. It's coming out, And so I don't think it was always like, it also filled him with rage. Again, we go back to him yelling at agents, but I don't know. I think this all points to something that we're talking about: responsibility and the life you lead versus, the insanity of leaving your job and walking across the country. But like, there's a piece in the book, in this anthology called Facts That May or May Not Have Led a Web Content Specialist to Contemplate Setting Himself on Fire. And in this piece, he acknowledges, I work as a web content specialist at Brown University, one of the, and he's listening to people saying, well, what do you have to complain about? And yet he addresses it from a lot of different angles, and he acknowledges it. And then the last line of this piece, which isn't a spoiler, is, at some point, will worker rights erode to the point where it no longer seems insane for a web content specialist to light himself on fire in protest of his working conditions? And so, Mark's at work writing, making weird stuff of his own. He acknowledges, like, at work, I go and make memes for the Brown University, and then I go get off work and I go home and make memes against the Brown University because I feel like I'm not treated as a human. And you can say it's a privilege for me to work here, but I don't feel very good. And then so what does he do? He says, I'm leaving this job and I'm walking across the country barefoot, and I don't care what it means. I'm scared of what it means for my life, but I'm not afraid to do it. And because I'm privileged enough to be able to do that, I have to do it. And it cost him his life, but I don't know. I think there's some line there where it's like a lot of people have a line that protects them from the work they do as an artist and the life they lead, and a lot of like motivational factors such as careerism and money, which we can all understand the fight for that. But like, Mark chose to say those values aren't as valuable to me as empathy, love, and ambition and exploration of this place. And so I'll do that. And so like, when I say he destroyed sentences, I mean he took that sentence that might be pristinely sitting in a book trying to describe the human condition, and he said the ham sandwich couldn't bear to be eaten by John, the web content specialist. And I don't know, that's a shitty version of a Mark sentence, but you get what I'm saying. Like, he infused his life into his work, and that meant anything could happen, and that's where the magic comes from.
Well, and I think too, back to what we were talking about, how he was like a true radical. He's somebody who never just took things at face value. He would look at it and try to understand it and get to the root of it. And the most moving thing in this anthology, The One on Earth, for me, was his Brown University personal statement when he was applying to Brown to get into graduate school. I don't know how, everybody's probably got their favorite Mark Baumer, but this was so funny and so unique, and also moving. And it felt to me also like it's a personal statement. It felt like the closest I got to him in his heart. I don't know. I felt access to him in this that I didn't feel necessarily as much elsewhere. Could just be like a statement of like personal taste, but that was my experience of it. And, you have to read it to understand. But you talk about destroying sentences or deconstructing things. I can't think of like a more meta, like deconstructive personal statement to get into graduate school. Like, it's so brilliant. You're like, oh, no wonder he got in, like it should not have worked. And yet it worked perfectly. It's a really, really good personal statement. I think I was very impressed with it. Did anybody else have that experience? Like, I don't know if anybody else likes it as much as I do, but that was a total favorite of mine.
I love that piece as well. And I have been thinking about this phrase, like to write something, or that a person writes something and it takes guts to have written it. And as Blake was speaking, was thinking about the sort of many denotative meanings of guts, right? So it's courage and determination and like this toughness, but also guts are like entrails, right? Or there's something deeply violent about writing with guts. And I think in Mark's work, thinking about the Brown piece specifically, it's like there, for listeners who don't know the piece, it's an epistolary application letter to Brown that's written to his mother with then sub-letters to the institution embedded throughout it that reveal these really kind of violent, there's something violent about the way he needs to frame himself for the institution, or there's a kind of prostration one must do for an institution in order to try to get in. And he's like playing with the ways in which we prostrate ourselves to institutions within that letter. And I think the violence of the Ivy League kind of shines through for me there. It's subtle, but it's light moving through the darkness. And then I think about like his piece Cow. I mean, he's so preoccupied just with, again, the violence that is enacted against the environment, which is us, right? So he's always writing through that violence because it is part of his being. So like in this piece Cow, it takes place in a slaughterhouse. A cow is being chopped into tons of pieces, and the piece ends with a factory employee like going home and eating some processed meat that he's just witnessed be killed. So there's both courage in it, and then there's simply a bearing witness to the just insane violence that is enacted upon other species and the environment that he's trying to transcribe, right? And that transcription's often like clinical and relentlessly detailed. And I think part of the destruction of the sentences that Blake speaks toward has to do with, the sort of relentless number of sentences within his work that we must bear as readers around that violence. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I'm thinking of like one particular sentence in the Brown personal statement that I've been like incanting to myself, like, and laughing about ever since I've read it, where it's cocaine, nothing matters, cocaine. Like, I mean, it's so funny and like so subversive, and just not something that I think most universities see in a personal statement from a prospective graduate student at an Ivy League institution. But it works. And a question that I have as an extension of that is the fact that Mark was straight edge. I know he didn't drink and he didn't do drugs, I don't think. And I'm just wondering, like, did he ever have issues with substance, or did he just never do them? He just never was interested, or it would seem like more in character for him to have just like looked at it, thought about it deeply, and just decided it wasn't for him. But I could be wrong.
I mean, I don't think so. He just didn't have the interest. Yeah. And I just think he probably viewed that stuff as like poison, and it wasn't part of like his plan in a lot of ways. And this goes back to like his purity. I mean, when I visited him that first time, he was doing a project where he was eating pizza every day for like 90 days. And it was just like that kind of like, there's like a childish wonder type of thing going on there. But like, he's interested in doing like little weird, like fucked up projects like that, not, like getting a 6-pack of beer and drinking it with his friend. Like, it's just not his thing. And I just want to go back to the destroyer of sentences thing really quick. I remember for a while he was taking pages out of like a Franzen novel and he was editing them, and he was literally destroying Franzen sentences. And in that page, he would circle new words and create what I thought was a more like interesting and gorgeous sentence on that page. And like literally destroying, a work and recreating something else. And then like he mailed me a couple of them. I still have a page or two. It's like, holy shit! Like this is great. And the other thing that Blake mentioned that's really interesting, how a lot of like artist writers have this line between like with their like their writing life, and then like they go to their state job and do that work, and like they keep that line very distinct. And it kind of rides on the cliche of, we all wear different masks. So like I wear my my certain work mask to work. Then when I'm writing, I have a mask on. When I'm with my family, I have like a different mask on. When I'm talking to you guys, I have a different mask on. But like with Mark, it's all the same mask in a way. Like it doesn't change for him. He's still like the same person. And when it came to some of the Brown stuff and him working at the library, I think that was challenged because the individual with the mask on being challenged by the institution above him. And that's where some of that violence comes into play. And I'm starting to ramble a little bit here, but the friends and stuff like that is just amazing. Like, and that literally destroying sentences.
I think too that there's like a phrase, like the phrase man of action or person of action comes to mind when I think of him. that distinguishes him from just about everybody I know. He was so courageous and willing to act, willing to, like, you talked about, like, the eating pizza for 90 days in a row, or walking across the country barefoot, or, you know, he walked across the country with shoes on prior to his barefoot walk, we should also mention. And he did it in 81 days, I believe. I marvel at that. As somebody who has done a long hike, I did, as my listeners have heard me say a billion times, I did a big chunk of the Appalachian Trail after college, and it was like incredibly physically grueling and mentally grueling. To do a cross-country walk with shoes on in 81 days is like 30 miles a day, I believe. Or maybe, yeah, I'd have to do the math. What is it, 3,000 miles or thereabouts across the country? Like, if you can divide it up, maybe it's 40 miles almost. So that's an incredible physical feat, to be clocking that many miles a day. So there's an intensity and a physical strength and courage in him, that is rare. Most people don't just do anything close to that, or don't act on their convictions the way that he did. And there's a quote that I read as I was, reading up on him prior to this conversation, where he said, a lot of times when I can't think of anything to write about, I'll just do something. So it wasn't just that he had the courage of his convictions. I think it was part of his creative system as a writer and as a visual artist, whatever it was, you know. And I think it's a really wise response to writer's block or ennui or whatever we fall into when we don't have the juice to create stuff. He would take action somehow. And I think there's a lesson in that. Like, does anybody have anything to add there?
I mean, to me, that feels entangled with time as sand through our fingers and the knowledge that life is short, right? And time is not limitless, so we must make what we can with time, even if the gestures aren't scare quote perfect.
Right. I think maybe that's where I can get some sort of tangled up sometimes, is that, like, I'm like, well, I could do this, but is it okay? Is it right yet? Like, he just kind of he had the courage to leap, and maybe, like, had, good intuition and, maybe like a stronger sense of himself. But I think a lot of us can sort of get caught up in perfectionism or concern about how we might be perceived. And he was willing to be silly and to just try and to experiment. And I think some of the comedic aspects of his creative self and his online persona, it's something I'd like to talk about a little bit more, because there's a deep sadness in it that I sense, and anger. It's all these kind of like lesser emotions or more difficult emotions that were at the heart of it. And his response was to be funny, which I think circles back to what we were talking about with regard to Gary Snyder and doing things because you love them. I think it's also a wise approach strategically if you want to bring people in, as you were saying, Blake. You can't be hammering people with grim statistics and sadness and expect them to get excited about joining you at the party. You have to it's like the spoonful of sugar. But I also feel like for somebody who is as clear-eyed as he was about the dangers that we're facing with regard to climate, and who was as true of heart as he was, and in kind of pure emotionally, there's a logic to it. How else would a person respond to the horrors that we're facing with respect to climate and with all of the damage that we've already done, through our own greed and ignorance, other than to be kind of absurd? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, it's the only possible way to ventilate the incredible despair that you would feel proportionately to what we're up against. Do you see what I'm getting at? Like, Blake, do you have like anything to add?
I have a lot to add. I think about this a lot as I don't know. Mark's an insane. So you take an insanely creative person, an insanely in tune to his surroundings and self person, and I don't know. I don't know if Mark's an empath. I don't know what empath even means, but I think Mark felt deeply and just could not stand to do anything else. Like we spend all of our time in this world, and everyone's so critical of it. It's easy to look around and see the garbage that's piling up and how it's going to end. And yet it becomes this like watchword, or it becomes this thing that is just known. And Mark would rather, I don't know, there's violence in his work because I don't think that it's easy to sit in those shoes. And even though he's wise enough and brilliant enough to be funny during it, there's some real anger and frustration in that humor, and it makes you laugh more because he's able to go there. But let's not ignore the truth of it, which is that life is really hard, and it's getting more and more bizarre the more we turn away, and we're having more and more opportunities to turn away. So use the system against itself, I guess, is the thing he's doing. He hates corporations. He hates these places, but like he wants to do a residency at Carl's Jr. I remember him writing a proposal letter about how he wanted to go to every Carl's Jr. in America and write there as a residency. Do you think he did that because he loves Carl's Jr.'s food? Do you think he wants to support Carl's Jr.? No, it's an inflammatory thing, and yet it's done in a way that gives him a reason to live, you know? Like, you can't walk around burning down Carl's Jr.'s, but you can turn Carl's Jr. to look at itself for people that are willing to open their eyes and look at it. And I think that's what he does, is he pulls back the curtain on some of these monstrosities that we walk around in and says, look at it. Look at that thing over there. It's terrible. Go away from it. Don't use it anymore. And that's valuable. That's a message I wish we could hear just every day, but we don't, because money controls the world. And you know, money. Mark's. It'd be fun to talk about the way Mark talks about money and commerce and all that, because I think there's some real depth to it that on the surface seems like this silly game. And Shane said earlier about how I read a bunch of Mark's pieces in front of a bunch of PhD poetry writers, and they as I kept reading it, their faces just dropped, and they thought, how is this art or something? I don't know. It's just like, people don't like for you to look past the curtain and talk about it, or so. Even people that are smart and wise and willing to look. So I don't know. It's like he's serving some intermediary purpose that ends up burning him up, I think. But it's like a Joan of Arc or something. I don't know.
Yeah,
that's hyperbole, but I don't think it's that much of hyperbole.
I don't either. And I feel like he's part of a necessary, his life and work are part of a necessary conversation that's happening increasingly around capitalism, which, you know, I'm 46 years old. You know, up until recently, it was really fringe to be discussing whether or not it's in our best interests, you know, to be framing our societies and our world around this system. Like, certainly it has its positives, but it also has its negatives. And I don't know. I just feel like that critique and that conversation is getting more mainstream, and he was a vehicle for that. Like, the ways in which we orient ourselves toward money. We've talked about how the consequences of what we do for a living are something that a lot of us either don't have an inclination or the time to consider. But he was definitely tuned in on that wavelength and wasn't afraid to talk about it. And, you know, a word that comes to mind that we haven't touched on yet is meaning, and like the quest for meaning. I feel like that was really at the heart of who he was. You know, he really wanted to lead a meaningful life, and he was interested in the meaning, the true meaning of things. You know, we talked about him like taking apart the college personal statement letter, you know, the kind of deconstructive or destructive way he approached sentence writing and storytelling and online persona, all of it. You know, he really was a person fixated on meaning. And I think that the intensity with which he lived and the choices that he made also often made him a lonely figure. he traveled a lonely road, both literally and figuratively. So, like, the words meaning and loneliness come to mind. I think you can see it in his videos and in his work. But to me, especially in his videos, as he's walking out there barefoot by himself day after day, with cars whizzing past him, or, you know, he's talking to birds or other animals that he's encountering along the way. He was by himself, you know, by choice, but also by circumstance. Like, Claire, do you have any thoughts here? Like, was he, like, you know, as you knew him in graduate school, was he a solitary, like an especially solitary figure? Was he a social guy? Maybe some mixture?
I have a lot of thoughts. I mean, Mark was amazing at bringing people together in community and doing so through humor. But he was also an only child. So he was well acquainted with loneliness and the fact that, you know, we are alone, but we're not alone, as my friend Ian Hatcher says. I have two other thoughts. One thought, I'm thinking about the etymological root of meaning, which is tethered to mind, right? And the mind is a lonely place. And he was, I mean, writers are of the mind, but he's somebody who was living intentionally in myriad ways and also sitting with his own mind multiple times a day, every day. So he was touching the, like, dark core of the mind and the mind's void, and that's a lonely place, right? And when we learn to sit with that, then we can act in the world. But I'm thinking too, I think it's important to think about the solitary male figure in space from a feminist perspective as a figure that's acting from a, how do I phrase this? There's a book called Why Does Patriarchy Persist that I like to teach. It's written by two psychoanalysts. And I think the male kind of avoidant impulse, or the Lone Ranger impulse, or the loneliness of Mark's project is tethered to ways that men are raised, particularly in Western culture, to, like, be self-sufficient, to be on their own, right? To go out into the world and hermit. And I do think that if he was still on Earth, I feel like maybe some of that would have been more undone, like that loneliness of the project that has to do with a kind of entrenched masculinity, which is beautiful and I admire, and I also think is complicated in terms of a gender politics. I feel if Mark was still here, or if we would have him on Earth in 30 years, I think he would be thinking through some of that avoidance, and that word feels even tricky to use, some of the solitariness of the project, right? Even though the project is about interdependency and acting with others and interacting with strangers, etc. I think there's ways he would have become a really powerful, like, community organizer, and would have come up with projects with others that would have to do with interdependence. I could imagine him having gone into publishing. I think about that a lot and hope some of that is making sense and not coming off as criticism, but rather a reflection on what it is to be a man in the United States, which is something Mark was actively thinking through in his work. And maybe Shane or Blake or you, Brad, have thoughts on that too. Shane,
do you have anything to add?
Well, like, I was like the idea of loneliness in Mark is something I've thought about a lot, because a lot of this conversation we've talked about Mark's internet presence and the aggression and so much of it. But, like, I think about, like, when the camera's off, like, what Mark was like, especially like him, you know, walking across America when the camera's off. He's just on the road by himself and his own thoughts. And, like, that's like an intense loneliness. And that's something I think about quite often. And then also, Brad, you had mentioned the absurdity of Mark. Also, there's, like, a sadness in that absurdity. And that comes through in a lot of ways. One thing I think about immediately is when Mark was doing his calling agents. And I think a lot of it was, like, trying to, like, kind of blow up publishing and this ridiculous process of, like, getting an agent. So he was just calling agents directly and leaving them voicemails and just being, you know, like, crazy, insane Mark. And it was, you know, total absurdity in a lot of ways. But there's one video specifically, and I recommend everybody looks it up. I think it's still on YouTube, where he calls Sylvia Molnar and leaves this really long message. And towards the end of it, the answering machine kind of beeps and says he's out of time. And it kind of segues into this like really deeply intimate moment where Mark starts talking about like leaving messages or talking to his grandmother and how he never had like enough time, and he just breaks down in tears and starts crying, and you're watching it unfold, and it's all, you know, like recorded, like there's no, he's not editing this shit, like this is the real thing. And then he kind of makes a joke like, well, I guess I'm like the first person who ever's, you know, cried on the phone with an agent or something, and then goes back into some of the absurdity and wraps it up. So I love that, like coming, you know, full circle, absurdity through sadness back to absurdity with like a ton of meaning. And I did not extend out of what like Claire said at all about masculinity. Maybe Brad or Blake want to expand on that, but the loneliness and Mark, the absurdity, the sadness, all those things are very important to me and things I think about a lot.
Blake, anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe some of it is like, why am I the only one doing this? It takes a lot of energy. I mean, we look at Mark's body and his physicality, and we've talked about his athletic prowess, and he was built to be able to walk across the country. But I don't know. I think of him, and there's a video of him at a protest. I think it's in Boston, or it might have been in Providence. I can't remember. But he's surrounded by other people that are acting like him, and he's at the front of the line, but like he's rallying the chant, he's yelling, and for once he seems really like he's angry, but he's in his element, and he's like, finally we're doing something. And I think the loneliness comes from like, how are the rest of you not more mad? You know, why are you just doing other things? Why do we have to talk to agents to get our books published? Like, and it's another place why he finds social media to be, I don't know. I'm in some ways like social media has changed a lot since he's been gone, but I think in its beginnings and what kind of like brought all of, I met Mark because of Blogspot probably, you know, and like these tools we have that are owned by corporations and run by corporations were supposed to be about communication and coming together, and yet look at what it turned into. Who feels like that about social media? No one. So I don't know. I think that rage has a place in saying like, I don't know why. What is it going to take for you to finally snap? Will it take that you can't breathe in the area you're standing in, because that's going to happen eventually? But can we do it before that? And so yeah, that's lonely. That it's lonely to be early to something that's going to affect everyone in the world.
Yeah, and Claire, you know, I think to comment, I think it's a really astute analysis to talk about the ways in which Mark's journey, like on foot and creatively and in his life, you know, are inextricable from the ways in which young men are raised and like enculturated in the West, especially. I wonder if he could have rallied, if somebody would have been like, hey, can I go with you? I think he would have been game. But I relate to this feeling of having to sort of figure it out on one's own, maybe especially as a man. I think of my wife and her friend group. I've talked about this a lot, how I just notice women are better at connecting with one another than men are, especially when you get into parenthood. I don't know. The dads are never hanging out the way the moms are, and that's a criticism of the dads. Like, I wish I were better at that, but there is something in men, something in me that I recognize where I feel like I've got to sort of do it on my own. And I also don't mean to be ridiculous, but I think of Forrest Gump and how, you know, he did his big run across the country and then eventually people started to join. It's hard for me to imagine that if Mark had kept going and we're still on this earth, and if he were still out there doing stuff, that he would not have found allies who would have willingly joined him, especially as the intensity of climate change escalates and becomes more apparent in everybody's lives. Like, at this point, anybody who's denying it or who isn't concerned about it, like, is just a like a complete, like, stupefying moron. Like, you'd have to be just completely detached. I don't know how else to phrase it, to not see what's happening in Jersey and New York and with Hurricane Ida in New Orleans. I mean, evidence is everywhere. The fires in the West, like, it's on top of all of us. So you have to believe that as things continue to intensify, that a guy like Mark, if he were out there leading the charge, would not have found people eager to rally to his cause.
And I think we see that with Greta Thunberg's activism, and she became active after Mark's passing with the solo school strike that eventually turned into the global climate march, right? And this massive movement led by youth to raise awareness about the climate crisis. So, yeah, I have faith in the solo activist rallying others, but it does take time. And as both Blake and Shane said, it's a lonely process.
Yeah.
But hopefully not lonely at the end.
Right.
One thing I wanted to mention, this is kind of coming out of nowhere. Like, I remember when I first met Mark being really surprised how, like, big he was. Like, he's like a big dude. Like, I don't know, Claire, but how tall, like, he's like 6'4", like, and he's just built like a huge guy. And I had always pictured, I don't know, like some smaller type of person doing these weird, crazy projects, but like just a big guy. And then Blake had mentioned, like, built to kind of do that thing, like walk across the country. I think he had posted, like a picture of his foot one time. He said this huge, wide foot. Like, yeah, like you can, like, I'm like a string bean. Like I couldn't even make it across New York State, but he was built for that stuff. So we talk about like masculinity and what it means to be a man, like in relation to like the size of him, and like you picture the size of him like in the world. And Blake had mentioned like him being at a protest and being up front. Like those visuals, I think, are meaningful and important in some abstract way, like the physicality, literally of his physical presence and the shit he was trying to blow up and deal with.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, anybody who resonates visually, you take him off the page and you put him on the screen, whether it's your phone or your computer or whatever, he definitely has a certain impact. And I guess I knew that he was that tall. I'd read it somewhere. But that aside, too, he had this long hair, the big glasses, the big sunglasses. He put some thought into his look. I guess we all do. But I think, in the aggregate, his physical size and strength and athletic prowess, and then the aesthetic choices that he made, with his appearance, with his long hair, and I don't know. I mean, it wasn't like he was out there in like a bespoke suit or anything. The guy was walking across America in like shorts and a t-shirt, but he cut a striking figure, I guess is what I mean to say. And I think it would be inaccurate to believe that didn't have some impact in the way in which his creative work was received, especially the online stuff. I think he was well suited to do the kind of work he did. Maybe especially with the benefit of hindsight. Like I look back on him and I think of like the image that he cut and that continues to live on online. And I don't know, it makes you respond, and it feels both true to him and true to the cause or something. Like, am I talking crazy?
He's also capable of using his body. He's a brilliant performer. He's very in tune to timing and using. He doesn't just have the body. He understands what it means to have the body, at least to some degree, and he uses it. And I don't know. I remember the first time I met him in person. It was like winter in Providence, and there was a reading, and he said he was gonna. He emailed me to tell me he was going to come, but it was during the time when he had just threatened me. So I was like, what's this going to be like when he shows up there? And he comes in and he says, I mean, I'm a decently sized person as well, but like he dwarfed me. And yet I didn't feel, it was like meeting this weird hybrid creature, and I look down and he's wearing he's dressed up for winter, but he has on flip-flops with his he has humongous feet. I mean, if you haven't seen pictures of his feet, he puts them up, especially as he's walking across the country, and he shreds his feet while he's walking across the country. And I think there's something else about that too, where it's this sacrificial, like, yeah, I was given this body, but guess what? Like, it doesn't last forever. So there's a to get kind of point back to what Claire was saying about masculinity. There's a responsibility, I think, when you have that body. You're like, well, I'm this big guy and all these people are getting hurt. Well, am I a coward? If I don't go and start showing up, then I'm a coward. So, and Mark's not a coward. The last thing you could ever call Mark is a coward. So I don't know. There's some responsibility. There's some personal, like, well, I'm being called to do this and I don't really want to, but I'm brave enough to do it. So, and then, that's all of the greatest leaders in history. Well, not all of them, but the good ones maybe. Yeah, well, I think the word that was coming to mind was improv. We've talked about how how he's used this. He knew how to use his physicality and knew how to use kind of like all these different media to get his art and messages out there. And you watch enough of his videos, like, he's a superb improvisational talker and creator. There are a lot of, I think a lot of his funniest moments are where he's just responding in the moment to his environment and interacting with it. I'm thinking of when he's like yelling at those guys playing golf. I think that was in Florida. There's a video where he's in Florida and he's like, "You're going to do sports, like, watch." And they can hear him. There's also like that fearlessness. Like, that's the kind of thing I suck at. I'm always like very, I don't want to bother people. And he was willing to sort of like poke people a little bit to get them involved in his theater. He had that kind of, that kind of creative courage that is hilarious on screen. So I think, as an improvisational artist, he needs to get some props there too, because not everybody can do that.
Yeah, I had a chance to read with Mark. I think it was shortly before he left for his walk. We read together in Hudson, and it was just brilliant. And like his timing, it was like watching like a stand-up comedian, because like so many writers, myself included, like just like I just suck at readings. It's just like very boring. Like, it's impossible to describe like what he did. Was part stand-up comedy / art and cracking jokes. And then at one point, he had made a comment, and he was going to read from, I think, I don't know which book he was going to read from, but he said he made this joke like, now I'm going to read from the one book you all came here to see me read from, because he knew nobody was there to like really specifically see him, and everybody like he had that self-deprecating sense of humor and a little bit of sadness at the same time. And like, unfortunately, I had to follow him, and it was just perfect. It was just like he gave like a perfect reading.
Claire, do you have anything? I mean, I'm thinking now too of his time as a teacher at Brown, which is sort of legendary. We talked a little bit about, Shane, you talked about, being a guest in his class and how unorthodox he was as a teacher and how willing to risk and to, be strange he was in that context. There's a performative and improvisational element to that as well. Was there? I mean, Claire, do you have any thoughts?
I do. One thought I have is when Mark came to Baby Castles, where I was doing some curation, he gave a performance that felt really improv, which included him like eating his phone at one point and then like pretending that he didn't remember the password to his laptop, it was all quite funny. It was a digital poetry series, so he was subverting the expectations of how he would be engaging with the technology. But I recall that after this performance, he posted to Instagram a pretty detailed outline of the performance that he had written up on his way to the city to give it. So I do wonder, and I can't speak directly to this, how often his improvisatory seeming performances were in fact well thought out or attended to in the mind. I also, another funny anecdote, I read with Mark in Providence, and I remember him coming up to the mic with like 5 copies of his book and reading from all of the different copies of the same book, which struck me as really absurd and very funny.
I want to talk, before I let you guys go, like I want to talk about a bit more about the physical cost of what he did. You know, obviously he lost his life walking barefoot across the country, but we've talked about his feet, these enormous feet that he had, and how big and strong he was. But I, not too long ago, had to get something out of my car. It was parked in the street outside of my house, and I didn't have shoes on, and I ran outside to get whatever it was out of my car, and like shredded the bottom of my feet walking like 20 yards from my front door to my car and back, to the point where I had to like have band, you know, it was bad. And I think about the fact that this guy walked, what is it, 100 days? You know, was it 100? I can't remember exactly the number, but it was certainly at 100 or over slightly, barefoot across the country, many hundreds of miles. The physical toll that takes. I know your feet become acclimated to, you know, walking on hard surfaces the more you do it. So I guess he built up calluses, but like just the physical difficulty of doing that and the level of commitment that he had was extraordinary. Like I would have made it, not very far. Let's put it that way. Maybe with shoes I could do, a pretty good distance. Especially when I was younger, but like to do it barefoot is just next level. And I don't think, you have to really consider what that means, to walk that far, that long in a variety of conditions, completely barefoot, and to do it day after day. I know he was in pain, more so than others on certain days, but I don't know. There's just something, Joan of Arc-like or Christ-like in his willing to sacrifice his body for his cause. I don't think that's hyperbole. Claire?
May I say, yeah, I'm looking at the introduction right now and thinking about Anna Hayward's article from the New Yorker again, and when Mark was rerouted from Zanesville to Jacksonville. Interesting that they're both Ville towns, as I say that aloud. He was rerouted not because it was cold or because he couldn't walk in the snow, but because of the chemical compound that's used to de-ice the roads, right? That those calcium chloride de-icing salts were cutting his feet. So that feels important to note. And in the introduction, I write about the blisters on his feet, which, as Blake mentioned, he photographed and put online every day. And I find those really hard to look at. Those blisters I liken to like eyes that are seeing the suffering of the world. So I think there's a poetics to the harm that his body takes on as part of this practice that are worth considering.
Well, he walked from Providence, just for people who are unfamiliar with his barefoot walk, he walked from Providence to, what did you say, Zanesville, Ohio?
Mm-hmm.
So Providence, Rhode Island to Zanesville, Ohio, and that's where he encountered the cold weather and snow and the de-icing salts on the road that cut his feet. What most people would have done at that point is go home or put on some shoes or, just cheat a little bit and like drive further west out of the snow. He went to Jacksonville, Florida. And basically, I don't know if it was latitudinally the same. Like, I'm sure he probably mapped it out a certain way, but it feels like he went kind of back to the beginning and just started walking west again. Like, there's just a level of intensity of commitment that is so rare. Like, and I think the average person would be like, this is crazy. But he had the courage of his convictions. Like, again, that word courage comes up. Like, he really believed in what he was doing. And I think he felt a strong sense of commitment to not let people down, especially as his work and his walk began to accrue followers as it progressed. Because there was, I think, increasingly as he went, some media attention, some digital media attention, and I think he really felt an obligation to come through once he was in. Like, he was just a guy who, if he was in, he was all in, right?
it's a hard thing to think about, honestly. Being committed to something. I mean, I guess I see it as a give and take, where it's like, well, I can go home and give up, and then what does that say? You know, my body's going to get shredded by the place I'm living anyway, to some degree. I don't think that's necessarily the guiding factor, but clearly he feels pressure to keep going, and clearly he feels like there's something pushing him. And I mean, it's no mistake that he's killed by an SUV driver who veers out of her lane, and is killed in that way. I mean, what more of a disgusting? I don't know. It's just it makes me speechless. It makes me speechless. I just don't know what to do about what those feelings cause and what it means for someone who's able to see the world, what's happening in the world, and try to take action to it, and to get snipped off by it. I mean, for lack of a better word, and like, it should be a call to the people that are here after him to know that, like, this person who we all revere and we all see as this person capable of anything gave his life for this. What does that tell you? How much more do you have? How much more time do you have to consider it? What can we do? You know, I take that question on a daily basis, and some days you find ways to do it, and some days you're at home writing or you're taking care of yourself. And he didn't take enough care. Or I don't know. That's a conundrum that I think is part of the enigma of Mark that will always make him a pin in our brains.
Yeah, I mean, he did put himself in harm's way, walking barefoot along busy roads that were filled with cars traveling at high speeds. He talked openly about this in his videos as he made progress across the country. He said, if you know, the most dangerous part of this, if I'm going to die on this journey, it is likely to be because of a vehicle. So there's something kind of darkly prophetic, you know, when you look back on what he was thinking about. And then there's even that picture, I want to say on the last day of his life that he took, or one of the last days of his life, where he takes a picture of his bare feet next to the word killed, like spray painted on the pavement. And there are certain people, what it makes me think about is that there are certain people in this world who really seem to be directing their own story and writing their own story. It's hard to escape the notion that he might, on some subconscious level, known what was happening or what was going to happen. I don't know. I certainly don't mean to imply that he wanted it to happen, but, you know, it's hard. I don't know. It's just hard with all of those images and videos in retrospect not to have at least some sense of that. And also to have a real sense of just uniqueness, you know, to have, to be writing such a poignant and, like, yes, like sad and tragic story, but also such a deeply meaningful story. He seemed to be kind of charting his course to a degree that is exceptional. Like, do you see what the line of thinking that I'm on? Like, Shane, do you have anything to add, or Claire?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the choice for him to continue the walk and to choose to go to Florida is something I've thought about a lot. Like the choice to go to Florida to reset the walk, and how making that choice, you know, ultimately ends in, you know, like Blake had stated very eloquently, like what happened. Like, of course, like Florida, like that's what happened with an SUV driver, suspended license, like everything about it is completely disgusting and grotesque. But I don't know where I was really going with that. But I think just the way Mark lived, back to his purity, like everything about it is like, well, maybe he did know. I don't know where I'm going with it. I'll defer to Claire or Blake, or back to you, Brad.
Yeah, I mean, I believe deeply in the unconscious, and I think Mark was in touch with his unconscious, the wilderness within us all, or the unthought known, right? Again, he's a meditator. Perhaps there's prescience that day about that which is to come in relation to the way he is inhabiting time in multiple directions at once. I put none of that past Mark, and deeply believe things are more complicated energetically than we logically know. I'm thinking about this quote that's become pretty popular via Mark, which is, quote, one day everyone will be able to walk down the middle of the road free from all the violence this society has built. Mark knew that what he was doing was dangerous. He knew the road was a site of violence, or conceptualized of the road as a site of violence, right? The road is paved over earth, period. And cars are violent machines that are built and sold. And he was killed by a very large car. So I think it's all there. I think Mark had this knowledge.
Yeah. Well, I mean, killed by an SUV in Florida, I want to say just days after the inauguration of Donald Trump, right?
Yeah, in a red state, right? I mean, Trump had won Florida, not by much, but, you know, Mark traveled there.
Yeah.
And Jacksonville was a red county within a red state.
Yeah, he was in Walton. I want to say he was in Walton County, like in the Panhandle, right? Or somewhere close to that. So it's just, there's a poignance, you know, to it. And a kind of like, there's almost like a literary feeling to it, you know, in a sad way. But, you know, I can't leave the conversation without acknowledging the irony that in his death, he received more attention and praise than he did for his protest while it was happening. You know, this is the way of things for human beings. And I'm party to this. You know, there's some part of me that this happens to me often when someone will pass away. And I'll either have no knowledge or a passing knowledge of them, and then I'll find myself grieving them after the fact in this really intense way, even though I failed to appreciate them properly while they were here. It could be somebody in the arts. It could be, I don't know, friend of a friend, but it usually happens on the internet. And I don't know, there's some anger in me, you know, and just disappointment in people and in myself to not have appreciated what he was doing and who he was more while he was here. It's just, I don't know. It feels very human, but also just disappointing. And hopefully there's like some lesson in there in terms of how to move forward and be better.
There is a lesson. And one of the ways I've accepted that lesson is when I walk near streets, I think of Mark. When I think about cars going past me on this, I can't cross the street without thinking of Mark. Mm-hmm. And you know what? Like, I pay very close attention to pedestrians and how they just step blindly into the street and assume that the other humans are going to take care of them. We don't live in a world like that. We should, and I hope that we can live in a place where we walk down the street and without the fear of violence. But right now, we need to be looking out for the people that, I mean, Mark is one we've lost, and the lesson we can take from that is to appreciate the people around us, outside of ourselves, outside of our family, the person on the street, and pay attention and look at where you're at and listen to others. And there's I've taken that from Mark. I feel Mark in me, and I don't think Mark's gone in that way. And I think it's a great opportunity to say, I neglected to think of this person while they were alive, but look at all the other people around me. And obviously that's a tall order in a world of billions, but start with one person.
Claire, anything to add there in terms of, you know, the way in which we can kind of retroactively grieve and recognize?
Yeah, I would add on to Blake's comment that and Mark was deeply privileged to be able to do this project. He wrote about it, thought about it, talked about what it meant to be, again, a male white body walking across the country. That's an immense privilege. People cannot walk safely down the street, or, you know, on a day-to-day basis. And we as people in the world can think of ways and enact ways to create more safety for people whose lives are precarious or who are threatened walking down the street. I mean, we have police murdering Black people for simply being on the street, right? What can we as white people do to create safer conditions? So these questions are on my mind vis-a-vis Mark's project.
Yeah, and I should say, too, I forgot to interject this earlier, but I think it's a really important point. is that when Mark was killed and all throughout his walk, he was wearing a reflective vest and he was walking against traffic, as you're supposed to do. He wasn't, blind to what was coming from behind. The traffic was coming towards him. He was on the left side of the road and was wearing a reflective vest. There's not much more a person can do to be safe walking around cars. So I just want to flag that in case people thought he was being needlessly reckless or something. He was taking proper precautions. And, somebody should be able to walk on the shoulder of the road in a protective vest and not have to worry about, getting hit by a car or walk on the sidewalk. And it's essentially the same thing from a distance perspective. So I just want to point that out. Shane, is there anything you would like to add to the train of thought that we're on around, kind of this delayed grief experience, or how to move forward in the world and honor the legacy of a guy like Mark, and to kind of incorporate some of the lessons that he taught us or was trying to teach us into the way that we live our lives?
Yeah, I mean, very briefly, like just kind of leaping off what you were just talking about, how he had a vest on, was walking properly. I think part of it is like, Mark was saying, like, I belong here. Like, all these cars and like, this is still the earth. And like, I'm a human being, I'm a person, and I belong here, and I'm going to be here, and fuck all this. And then also, like, as far as like a lesson, some of it just boils down to what I've taken from it and from Mark's legacy. And that's something I think about daily is like, how could I just be a good person, like be a kind person, be a decent person, and be conscious and present about things the way Mark was. It's impossible to do. But I'll definitely end on that.
Yeah, last thing I want to say is a kind of confession, and I'll tie it to a recent personal story. Like, my wife and I just lost a friend to cancer this past week. She had a battle with ovarian cancer and died, and she was just and I didn't know her until recently. This is not like a long time friend, but she was so kind to us. And in particular was really kind to our kids, and in particular my son, who has disabilities. And when you're the parent of a child with disabilities, you always notice when people are like move toward your child with disabilities instead of away from that child. And she just went right up in there, and she had she could do this with anybody. Like, you just met her and she had like immediate rapport, super sweet, easy person to be around and to know. And like the last person you would ever want to see have to go through cancer and a death at a young age, just like a great person, like why her kind of thing. And the response to her passing has been so extraordinary. I can't even begin to tell you. She worked in television, and so there have been tributes on television, even though she was like a behind the scenes person. People you would never think, like openly weeping, talking about how extraordinary she was. Like, there's just, it's not hyperbole, like truly unique and extraordinary, the impact that she had on people and the consistency of it from person to person to person. We all have the same stories. She's just a unique soul. I think Mark is of a similar ilk. And the confession that I want to make, which I hope is also tied to some sort of call to action for myself, and my wife and I have joked about this, is that we're like, I don't think that many people are going to come to my funeral. Like, I worry, like, I don't think there's going to be there's not going to be video tributes, it's sort of dark humor, but like, it makes me think about my actions on the planet, the legacy that I might leave behind. Maybe that's a good goal, is to be really grieved for good reasons. And to try as best you can to kind of live up to the ideals of these people who have this extraordinary ability to connect with people and to touch people. Like, do you see what I'm getting at? Like, that's what Mark's life and work make me think about that. He lived a short life, but he lived a deeply meaningful life, and he had a unique ability to move people, and he continues to, even after his passing from his his bodily form into whatever the next realm might entail. I certainly feel like he's still here in a lot of ways.
I think it's worth saying that, we say like, we're talking about like, there's a lot to be done and we don't know where to start. We don't know. I mean, how do you be a better person? Well, a little love goes a long way. So, you're describing a person approaching your child instead of moving away from your child, like that. You remember that. And there are lots of little things. Like I remember the last time I saw Mark in person, I did a reading in Boston. Mark was one of 3 people there. He got a train from Providence, came in, sat in the crowd. We went out and had pizza afterwards. He went home. About a year later, he emailed me and said, "That's still the greatest reading I've ever been to. That was one of my favorite readings ever." And like all of Mark's work and his activism and his writing means a lot, but like little things that show someone sees you or acknowledges your effort can change your life. And like, so just like as simple a thing as reaching out and saying, "Hey, I really admired what you did here," or I was thinking about you today and just wanted to say, have a good day. Like that changes the world by itself for one person. And so that's what I mean, like nobody's perfect, but you can begin with things like that. And that's what I try to do as a thing. And it's not so hard as we make it out sometimes. I mean, there are levels to it, but that's a way to begin.
Shane, any final thoughts?
I mean, no, not exactly. I mean, just I'll reiterate what I had said earlier about just kind of what Blake was saying, just being a good person. Like, how do you be a good person in a difficult society and culture? And just being aware and mindful each day. And I really like what Blake said about, those little things. It sounds like sentimental or cliche, but it is true. Like, it's very, very true. So I'll end on that note.
And I feel like you're ending on that note while bells are ringing, so that adds added significance to whatever it was you just said.
Yes.
I'm going to take that as Mark confirming or affirming what you're saying somehow through the ether. Claire, your closing thoughts?
Those are the church bells, and on that note, I have a part of a Bible verse for us.
All right.
I've been memorizing 1 Corinthians 13 over the past couple of months. It's the Bible verse about love that I always associated with like corny fonts and TJ Maxx. Like you can buy a poster of 1 Corinthians 13 at TJ Maxx. Do you know this verse? Love is patient, love is kind.
Right, yeah.
Love does not envy or boast. But there's a line in it I really love that's, if I give away all I have and deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. And that feels so encompassing of Mark's practice, which was fueled by love. And I want to echo Blake's sentiment that we should all be moving closer toward one another amidst all that is happening in this world, right? We really need each other. And to be together in love is one way that we can begin to fight the destruction of this planet and survive collectively.
Yeah, and I'll close by, since you're quoting the Bible, I'll quote the Diamond Sutra, I think it is, from Buddhism, and the line, "This is because that is," which is one of the earliest human statements on ecology, I think, or one of the most profound. And I think this is at the heart of Mark's life and work. We talked about the loneliness of his journey and the ways in which that can be tied to how young men are raised in Western society. But he certainly knew that we're all connected, not just to one another, but to all life on the planet and to the planet itself. We are nature. We are a product of nature. And I think he was trying to remind us of this, the interconnectedness of all that is, and the obligation that we have to one another to take action to ensure that we can live peaceably and comfortably on this planet and be stewards of it in a way that's commensurate with its majesty. Like, I don't mean to get into purple prose, but I hope you know what I'm getting at. Like, he certainly makes me think of all of those things. I I mourn his loss, even though I never really knew him. And I think a lot of us feel that way. And I'm really appreciative of all of you guys for the work that you did in putting together this book and for the time that you've taken talking to me here today so that we can, I don't know, create this little bit of audio that will help his memory and his work find other people. So really appreciate it, you guys. Thanks for doing this. And the book is called The One on Earth, Selected Works of Mark Baumer. It's out there now, and I advise all of you to familiarize yourself with him. Thanks, you guys.
Thanks, Brad.
Thank you, Brad.
Thank you, Brad.
All right, everybody, there you have it. That is my conversation with Blake Butler, Claire Donato, and Shane Jones. Blake and Shane edited the new collection, The One on Earth, Selected Works of Mark Baumer, available now from Fence Books. It includes a lovely foreword by Claire Donato. Once again, the book is called The One on Earth, available now from Fence Books. Go get your copy, and while you're at it, go explore the life and work of Mark Baumer online and his environmental and activist legacy, all of it. Just go to thebaumer.com. That's a good place to start. Let me double check that. I was just looking at it. Yeah, thebaumer.com. And, it's a little heartbreaking because you're looking at all these images from his walk, but it's a great launching point into all the other places online that he posted. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat. There's the vlog, there's the blog. I mean, he was extremely prolific online. So thebaumer.com. One more time, the book is called The One on Earth. The Otherppl podcast is now 10 years old, and it has been free for almost the entire time. The entire archive is available to you, the listener, for free. It's a listener-supported show. If you like this program and you get something from it, if you listen regularly, if you're happy that the show is 10 years old now and you want to support it, go to patreon.com/otherpplpod. Patreon.com/otherpplpod. For as little as $1 a month, you can support this show. So whatever your income level or situation, or, $1 a month, or $3 a month, or $5 a month, it goes on up the scale. As you go up the scale, you can get stuff. There are little bonuses: t-shirt, coffee mug, sticker, tote bag, book club subscription. I will write you a postcard by hand. I will wish you happy birthday. I won't sing you happy birthday, but I will wish you happy birthday every year that you support this show. What do you think about that? Patreon.com/otherpplpod. If you want to write to me, the email address is letters@otherppl.com. All right? Okay, that's enough out of me.